Welcome back to the panel discussion, Predictive Intelligence, the Marriage of Data and Analytics in Cybersecurity, sponsored by TIBCO here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests today are Stephen Dennis, Data Analytics Engine Director at the Homeland Security Department's DHS Advanced Research Projects Agency, that's located in the Science and Technology Directorate. David Bray is Chief Information Officer at the FCC. He's also Eisenhower Fellow to Taiwan and Australia and a Harvard Executive in Residence. And we have Julie Ard, Senior Principal Cyber Engineer and Architect at the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity. And so before the break, we were getting into some of the big data issues. And I wanted to ask you about this idea, and we were talking about Einstein, which gathers data, and all of these network tools gathers data. In fact, TIBCO has published a chart showing 16 or 17 of the possible sets of tools that you could have feeding log data into a network that's not even transactional information or application information. And so tying that idea with all of this data gathering and somehow into analyzing events, it seems like it's getting an awfully maybe overload of data. So maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, so I think overload is certainly contextual, and it depends on the, as we were discussing earlier, the maturity model that an organization subscribes to with respect to analytics. And so you're overloaded when you can no longer use the tools that are in front of you in order to access the volume of data or the variety of data that might be available to you for doing a specific mission. And so we've been working on that at Homeland Security by hosting a laboratory that allows folks to come try different ways to conduct analysis using emerging tools that might be coming from industry or from government, and being able to actually process the data that they're used to processing. So having a laboratory environment that allows for folks to see how different tools work is a great way to move them beyond their data overload. Also, we spend some time looking at the decision process that an organization is actually implementing to try and figure out, does that data flow make sense? Does the workflow make sense? And understanding the real problem before applying technology, and I think that makes a huge difference.
Because really, in all of this data, you're not looking for anything except maybe this 6 bits or that little byte there. And so the question is then, how do you find what's valuable in all of that? But then the problem is tools upon tools.
That's right.
And so the complexity of even getting towards simplicity, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot
of sense.
Worse. And so that's why I was saying it's important to consider the maturity level of the analysts that you're working with. And so what are they able to actually grasp quickly? For example, we were working with a group who was very used to using spreadsheets to do their work. We wanted to jump immediately to graph analytics because we thought that was exactly where the problem was, but it was too much for that group to embrace that method of doing analysis. So instead we went to them in the spreadsheet model, helped them understand how to process their big data that way. And then about a year later they came back to us and said, we want to see this more like transactions and graphs, and so giving them time to actually grow and to understand the power of the tools that are available is a very important part of the process. And so we as scientists and engineers might look at it and say, well, we're going to immediately jump to the most sophisticated solution that creates the less work, but maybe that's not something that the organization or the individual analysts are ready to adopt.
And I would think that if you're getting people to move from 500,000 line spreadsheets to some other methodology, then that would be a good chance to move all of that analysis to the cloud, which
Absolutely.
might be a more logical place for it to be.
Well, and as long as you put the infrastructure in place so that they can make those advances with fewer engineering changes, that's really the approach we're taking.
Other comments on that complexity and data overload question?
So to frame the context of the data overload, the amount of data on the face of the planet is doubling at least every 2 years, so that in less than 6 years...
Not the amount of wisdom, just the data.
No, data. This is data. And that we'll have 9.6 billion versions of the Library of Congress in less than 6 years on the face of the planet.
And I haven't even read the first shelf there.
I was going to say. So it's apparently more data than all human conversations we've ever had as a species times 2. So we are literally going to be drowning in data. At the same time, I actually kind of feel like everything that's old is new again in some respects, because I was involved back in 2000 to 2005 with what was called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program at the CDC. And we had two tracks, which was, one was laboratory, which was, there's no one test that says this is anthrax or this is plague. Same is true for cyber, that you actually have to go through almost like a defined process to identify if the signature is something that's malicious. Has it been morphed? Has it been changed? We need that same thing that is sort of the diagnostic side. But that alone is actually not sufficient. You also need the tipping and queuing. And so if you think about it, there are things that are showing that maybe reconnaissance is being done on your network, that maybe someone is trying to actually do an attack. And so in the bio realm, we have what's called epidemiology. And we actually knew that the severe acute respiratory syndrome happened about 9 months before it was finally publicly admitted. And those nations involved actually admitted it. And we knew that actually because the price of garlic went up. Because garlic is seen as a cure-all in certain places. And so when the price of garlic goes up, that's a sign that there's a demand for garlic, therefore something's going on. And so the same is needed in the cyber realm, which is what are those tipping and queuing? That's not the diagnostic that this is the actual malicious payload, but something odd is going on here. And that only happens when you begin to pool your resources and you're not trying to fight the cybersecurity battle just as yourself. And so cloud offers that opportunity, but it is trying to figure out what's the most important data. And so then that gets to, I'd like to see more experiments with the private sector and the public sector as to what are those important diagnostics that are the equivalent of the price of garlic has gone up, that is showing that something odd is going on over here. You don't know what it is exactly, but you need to pay more attention to it.
So that brings in analytics of data from completely other different domains, which the government may have already. They do track commodity prices and farm prices, and there's lots of data that have nothing to do with cybersecurity. But so that brings in the element of imagination at some level.
You have to have the element of imagination, of creativity, and it's also just recognizing that I increasingly think that the word government is an outdated 20th century term, and we need to talk about public service in the sense that, packet latency between Topeka, Kansas and DC is not 4 days on horseback anymore. It's now milliseconds. And so what can we do to involve members of the public directly if they want to? They don't have to if they don't want to. Involve private sector partners and government professionals, because a lot of this actually, as was said by Stephen earlier, the targets are really the private sector. I mean, you hear about government just because we are transparent about what happens, but the targets are really the private sector where intellectual property is. And the question is, what can they do to actually try and work together to share what they're seeing so that they're not trying to defend everything by themselves, but they're actually working together and bringing the data together to move things ahead.
Okay, Julie, thoughts?
Yes, I don't think anyone will argue that we are definitely drowning in data. It is expensive, computationally expensive to collect, it's expensive to store, it's expensive to process, and it's not all useful data. So while you have too much data, you're missing actually what you want, because you can't find that needle in the haystack. And also it's not reliable when you're, if you have an endpoint system, for example, an endpoint sensor, when that endpoint is compromised, that's when you really want the data, and you can't trust it because the endpoint's been compromised. So that's why the cloud environment is so exciting. The data's already all there. You don't have to go get it from an endpoint system. You can leverage the processing power of the cloud. And as I mentioned, if you architect your house in such a way that each room has a specific special function, and then the sensors are finely tuned to that function, you know better what to look for. And your analytics, as someone mentioned, this looks funny, let's look more closely at that, and the analytics can do that.
So is this theory or this way of looking at it applied to the operation of IARPA as a sub-agency, but also in some of the research you're doing that you will be delivered to the greater intelligence community for its work?
Yes, actually the output of the Virtue project will be open source. So as the government is moving to the cloud, we see also in the private sector, and the results of our research will be available to anyone who wants to use it.
That was called the
Virtue program.
The Virtue program. And so what is the status of it at this point?
We are currently in source selection, so I can't comment a whole lot on that.
So it's in source selection. Okay, no need to say any more.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll hope that source works out for you when the time is finally
we expect
selected.
the program to start this year.
And I wanted to get to continuing on this idea of big data and trying to find something through it. David, you had the concept of fog.
Yes.
And that seems to apply here.
So recognizing that we in the field of technology always come up with interesting metaphors, it is the recognition that we are fast approaching an era in which you are not going to be able to bring together in a centralized place all the data you need to make security decisions or resiliency decisions. And so what we're really trying to think about is how can we actually have things at a localized context so that you can make those decisions. And these are going to be sort of your local clouds that are going to be developed ad hoc on the fly, as opposed to a dedicated cloud provider that might be so removed that you're going to introduce additional latency. And so you're thinking about ad hoc mesh networking. You're thinking about how can you actually involve those partners. And as Julie said, the question is how can you build in trust, recognizing that from the start, things may be compromised, things may be hard to trust. And so in some respects, I recommend any organization sort of build with the assumption that you already have some active exploits in your environment, and you basically have to build with that in mind. You think about it, no submarine would flood when there's a single leak. They always have the ability to do compartmentalization and have things that can close off. The same thing is true of organizations.
That's the resiliency kind of idea.
The resiliency, I think it's paramount, because the reality is, in an always connected world, even if you do, I mean, there's a wonderful example. About a year ago, there was a hedge fund in England, which they did everything they needed to do on the security front, but their chief financial officer got a phone call from someone saying, we need to reset your user account, could you please give us your password? And they did, and of course 24 hours later the hedge fund had no more money. And so you can do everything right on the technology front and not solve for the human factor. And so you should always assume things will go wrong, you always need to be resilient. But that said, what is that public good? And that's where I really think we do need to think about public service involving the private sector. I mean, a lot of these commercial companies are seeing things that by themselves may just be sort of 1/10 of the value of if they pulled it together in a way that was de-identified, had safe harbor. If we had situational awareness across all these different companies as to what they were seeing, we collectively would be 100 times better off. But how do we overcome that sort of collective action problem of which companies may not feel necessarily trusting about giving it to the government per se? Maybe the solution is actually to have a nonprofit or something that does it instead, that is backed by public service entities. But this is one of the things that we're talking about at Harvard is, what is the equivalent of the daily health of the internet report that can inform you as an individual when you buy devices? Because that's the other thing is, right now, consumers don't feel the imperative to buy secure devices. And in fact, the research shows that if it adds more than about 60 cents to device, you're probably not going to pay for it. So in some respects, we have this challenge of the market is not creating a demand signal for additional security. At the same time, we're seeing these breaches happen on a daily basis. The question then is, how do we move this forward in such a way that we can actually encourage both individual members of the public and public sector private partners to recognize this is a collective action problem?
And that gets me to a question, kind of a practical application of this, Stephen, and that is the policy of the government, and the kind of the keeper of the policy, if you will, is Homeland Security, again, down the hall from you, but continuous monitoring and continuous diagnostics and monitoring. That started out as a very basic level. Are we patched?
Right.
Well, what we're talking about is way beyond whether you're patched, but really the behavior of an organic system that is as big as the world. That's why you can't fit it in only one corner of the world, because it is the world. And so what is the thinking with respect to what agencies should be monitoring now, besides patches?
Yeah, certainly. Well, and there's a big focus on insider threat, and as I mentioned earlier, instrumenting the system for productivity purposes is almost the same thing. But so I think folks should be looking way beyond just patches in order to understand their network and their system, and to have options, as you mentioned earlier, about, you know, what do you do when you detect a threat? Are you going to quarantine it? Are you going to change the way your network works or the way your machines work to make it more difficult? And so I think when I look at this environment where we have lots and lots of data and information, you know, we've been strategizing for the last year about how do we get through this fog that David was mentioning. And we've come up with an area of focus in conjunction with the National Science Foundation called RealTime Analytics for multi-party, metro-scale, multi-latency networks. And so what kind of analytic environment can we bring to the table that allows us to see unfolding live data streams in the context of historic information that we may have, so that we get a better picture of the analytic that we're computing. Also, how we will treat data that might not be trusted, So there might be data where device attestation was great, but there might be data that comes from the unknown. I don't know how to trust that. How am I going to factor in error from those data sources in order to make use of that analytically? And then further, to instrument a system that's doing this itself so that it understands when data refresh is likely. And so maybe the system can communicate to me that in the next 2 minutes I'm going to get a lot better data and it's worth waiting. So if you think about that response context that DHS has, it'd be really nice to know that if I don't make a call in an emergency response situation for 2 more minutes, I'm going to have a much better decision at the end of that. So we've just begun working on this idea as a way to coalesce and organize and structure the academic community, industry, in a way that helps them help us brainstorm through this space so that we can create that next generation analytic, which I think would do continuous monitoring, but a lot more.
So what I'm hearing is the application of the computing power that's out there to the computers themselves, much more to I guess an order of magnitude greater degree than has been done until now.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. And then you realize too that you have computational strategies that can be employed. David was mentioning, you could compute something locally with mesh networks. You could, but understanding that when you design the code, understanding that when you design the system, and all of the ramifications of that are going to be important. Not to mention the levels of autonomy that have to be part of that system, and then what are our policies, our cyber policies and other governance policies for such systems, and I think that's an even trickier space. We've been watching the driverless vehicle area very closely just to see, how is the government going to respond to autonomy in high consequence decision making such as exists in driverless vehicles.
All right, good place to take a break. My guests today are Julie Ard. She's Senior Principal Cyber Engineer and Architect at the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity. David Bray is Chief Information Officer at the Federal Communications Commission, also Eisenhower Fellow to Taiwan and Australia, and Harvard Executive in Residence. Stephen Dennis is Data Analytics Engine Director at the Homeland Security Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency, part of the Science and Technology Directorate. And I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. Our discussion is Predictive Intelligence, the Marriage of Data and Analytics in Cybersecurity, sponsored by TIBCO here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.